Howdy gang, this is Jerry, and coming to you today from my workbench to give a tool review. Today I've got the Milwaukee M12 cordless soldering iron, and I saw this at my local big box store and caught my eye because I have some of these Milwaukee M12 tools, and generally the Milwaukee stuff is pretty good. And I looked over the package, read some of the specs on it, and decided I wanted to try to pick this up. I've had several cordless soldering irons in the past and never really been too happy with them, but we'll see how this one will work. And also I figure this ties in fairly well with my channel because most of my RC videos are related to more entry-level type RC work, and normally for an entry-level guy, maybe a cordless soldering iron might not be the first choice over a decent soldering station, corded soldering station, but depending on how well it works, maybe this could work as your only soldering iron. So I'm going to run through this review of this tool here. I'm going to talk about the specs on this tool. I'll open the package, we'll see what we get in it, and I'm going to throw a battery in it, and we'll see how it performs. I'm going to compare it to my soldering station on my desk, which is a 60-watt Radio Shack adjustable digital soldering station that I really like. And we'll see how this Milwaukee cordless compares to my workhorse desk workstation. Okay, before I crack this thing open, let's take a real quick look at the packaging just to kind of see what I actually have here. And again, here's the part number up here, 2488-20, the M12 cordless soldering iron. Couple of things. This is the tool only version. It does not come with a battery. It does not come with a charger. So if you are not invested in the M12 system already, you probably want to buy the version of this that comes with the battery and charger. I saw that on Amazon for about $150. This tool only was about $80. A couple of other tidbits that I noticed on the packaging. It says heats quickly, 18 seconds. I'm not sure if this is 18 seconds until it's ready to melt solder, or if that's up to full temperature in 18 seconds. I'm gonna have to test that and find it out. 3-stop pivoting head. It's kind of nice. It's already kind of in the middle position, and it comes with an extra tip. The tips on here are interchangeable. They use this barrel sleeve, which is kind of standard, semi-standard for interchangeable tips for soldering iron, and I have a lot of these already because my other soldering iron uses that. Couple of other things I wanted to point out here on the back of the package here. Pull this closer up to the camera. 750 max temp. 90 watts. Get that a little closer. That's a fair amount of power. My desk soldering station is a 60 watt, and it feels like it has a good amount of power. And I used a 40 watt iron or 25 watt iron for a lot of years. So that's 90 watts. That's a lot of power. So we'll have to see how that actually stands up. And it has a LED work light runtime. This is something else I wanted. 45 minutes, and the little asterisk down here says on one M12 red lithium compact battery. The red lithium is their premium lithium battery. So the red lithium compact, I believe, is a 2 amp hour battery, but I'm not 100% certain on that. So 45 minutes on one of the compact batteries, that's not bad. So let's go ahead and crack this bad boy open and see what it actually has in the package. Okay, we've got everything out of the package. Basically, it came with a small instruction manual in there. Most of the stuff in here is just warnings and such. It does have a small functional description that talks about the different parts. Has a very short section on operations. Basically, it talks how to press the button and rotate the head. Nothing terribly groundbreaking or important in there. The wedge tip that comes in the package, I'll talk about this real quick. I mentioned earlier that I do like soldering with a wedge tip. This is my soldering iron that I use the most. And so there's the difference in the size of these two wedge tips. And get a little kind of close to the camera here. Here, I'll grab a tape measure here. You can kind of see the difference in the size of these wedges. So The one wedge is about that I use the most is maybe 30 seconds, and then the wedge that comes with this kit is about 3/16, so twice as wide. And for soldering larger wires, 10 gauge wires with large plugs, you could probably get by with this large wedge. It would work fine. If you get into a situation where you're trying to solder wires onto a speed controller or a motor where the terminals are kind of close together, you might end up wishing you had something a little smaller, like the small wedge that I have here. The tip that the iron comes with is a cone tip. And cone tips are nice for very small detailed, when you really need to be careful about where you're placing your heat. But sometimes you'll run into that you can't transfer enough heat with these small cone tips. And so this small cone tip, I've done a lot of soldering with cone tips. This small cone tip will probably be good for 16 gauge, 14 gauge soldering. By the time you get up into 12 gauge and 10 gauge and larger, though, you're going to want a wedge tip. And this wedge tip, I'm thinking that it might be a little bit big for our RC car uses. It's not too big of a problem, though, because this does have this removable collar. You can just spin the collar off, and then this collar comes off, and then the tip slides off. And be careful, this is the ceramic heating element. They do crack fairly easy, and then you can just drop the new wedge, or the new tip you want on it. And so switching tips is that easy. Of course, you want to make sure this is nice and cool, or wear some heat-resistant gloves. If you don't have the correct tips, you can buy packs of these tips. This one is from Radio Shack, back when Radio Shack existed, and this was like $5, and I got a pair of tips, both a chisel tip and a cone tip. So I'm going to start off trying to play with this larger wedge tip. Okay, so I'm done with my first soldering project here, and this is what I did. Is I had this speed controller, and it had these very long leads on them, and so the soldering project was fairly basic. I desoldered the leads from these terminals. I had trimmed me up some very short pigtails, tinned the wires. This is like a number 8 gauge wire. I believe these are I think these are number 12. So much heavier duty wiring that I'm going with. Well, the new leads for the speed controller. Desoldered the terminals, tinned these 3 short pigtails, soldered them on the terminals, soldered on the 6.5 millimeter buckets for bullets, and then heat shrinked it all. And I went ahead and I used clear heat shrink. I've been doing that recently. And then plus, for the sake of this video, it allows us to actually look at the solder joints, even though I've got it all safely heat shrinked up. And they're not the cleanest solder joints I've ever done, but they're acceptable. For my use, they're fully wetted out. You can see the stranding in the wires, but if you look at them, I don't know how well this will come out in the video, but you can see the stranding, but the stranding is completely encapsulated in solder. So this is not a dry solder. So let's just talk about the experience of using this iron real quick. For the desoldering, for those of you that have soldered on some of these larger speed controllers, sometimes it's a bit hard to get enough heat into these terminals to desolder. That was not a problem. Oh, and one other tidbit, as I started work, if you can see in the background here, I have the small wedge tip on right now. I started working with the big wedge tip, and so the first couple of steps I did, I was using this large wedge, and then I'll mention when and why I switched over. So I started with the big wedge, desoldered these 3. That went relatively quick and painless. It only took 15 to 30 seconds per terminal to desolder them, so that was pretty nice. Tinning the new wires was, again, very, very quick and painless. It really did good at soaking in the heat. And then when I had one end tinned already, as I'm tinning the other end, this end would not melt. It would not remelt. And sometimes that happens on low power soldering irons when you have a very short piece of wire, is the heat soaks all the way through, and your end on this end won't tin until the solder on this end is already melted. And that's kind of a sign that your soldering iron is very underpowered. And that was not a case. It was able to tin both ends of these wires individually without melting the solder on the other end. Resoldering the new wire onto these terminals, again, it went fairly quick. The only real issue I had was that these terminals are not made for number 8. I think these terminals are probably a number 10 max, and so that's part of the reason why it looks like everything's kind of chubbed out a little bit around the terminals, is this wire is larger than what this speed controller is really designed for. Not a fault of the soldering iron, but again, it's all things considered, I feel like it's a fairly neat solder job. And if you can see some scorch marks around the casing, most of that is from previous solder jobs. I bought this speed controller used, and I've already changed the wiring on it one time, so this is my second time to change the wiring. So this speed controller's been around the block a few times. And then, then I got to soldering the cups on this end, and this is where I switched tips. Hang on, let me pause for just a second here. So here is one of the cups that's new, and with this tip, the way I like to solder these is I'll put the tip inside the cup, you know, like, oh, let me get it back in frame, like this, and then I'll start adding wire solder in, and kind of get a good bit of solder inside the cup. And of course, I'm not holding it in my hands, I'm holding it in a jig. I'll have it sitting on the desk like this, and I'll put the soldering iron in it, and then the solder, you know, feed solder in it until the cup has a nice layer of solder on the inside, and then I'll dip the wire in and then add a little bit more heat, I'll make sure the wire is warm first with the soldering iron, and then I'll dip the wire in the hot solder, maybe add a little bit more if I feel I need it, and then let it cool. Okay, this wedge tip, and then also there's this hole in the side, and I can apply heat directly to the wire through that hole. Okay, with the wedge tip that comes with it, again, this is just, it's too big for these cups, and so that was kind of my notion when I saw this in the package, that this wedge tip would be really too big for a lot of what we're doing, and that kind of was the case. Most of what I did here was fine, but this last step with these cups, and these are large cups. A lot of times I'm working with a smaller cup, like say here's a 4.5 millimeter cup. Sometimes I'm working with a 3 millimeter cup. These are a big at a 6.5 millimeter cup. This is a big cup, and this tip was still too big. So that's really the only time I had a complaint, and I had this wedge tip. I could have switched to the cone tip that the soldering iron came with and probably been just fine. And then I finished the solder job out with the clear heat shrink. So that was the solder job, and how did I feel the soldering iron itself performed? Overall, it was a good experience. A couple of things to point out. Number one, you'll see that I have my XC 4.0 battery in here. My smaller batteries, I've got one here on the charger, my compact batteries didn't last very long at all in this soldering iron. These are the batteries that came with my M12 starter set many years ago. So these are fairly old batteries. They say red lithium, but they're not the XC high power lithium batteries. And I suspect that the discharge rating for these batteries just isn't high enough. The discharge for these is fine for the brushed cordless tools, M12 tools, but you get into the high power tools and these batteries just really start lagging a little bit. I've noticed that also with the M12 Sawzall, or excuse me, not the Sawzall, the Hacksaw that I have, that sometimes these batteries, they really don't last very long at all. And I think that was the case with this, is that the soldering iron at 90 watts, that's about a 5 amp continuous draw. And for I believe inside here, these are just kind of a standard 18650 cell. And 5 amps is actually a fair amount for a 18650 cell. So unless it's a special high discharge cell, and that, I believe that's what the XC denotation is that these are a higher discharge. And so with this battery, The soldering iron sailed through no problem. I have 2 of these compact batteries, and both of them only lasted about 5 minutes. And I actually cycled them on the charger a couple of times because I thought, well, maybe it wasn't all the way charged. And so I would check them on another tool, and yep, sure enough, the other tool to show it's dead. I would cycle it on the charger, put it back in the soldering iron, and get 3 to 5 minutes off of it. So I suspect these batteries are simply, well, I think it's partially that these are old battery, and then partially because they're not the XC series batteries. So, and I'm not sure which series batteries, if you buy this one with the battery plus charger, I don't know if it comes with an XC or a standard battery, but that might be something to keep an eye on if you go that route. And if you already have M12 batteries and you're looking to buy the tool only like I did, make sure you have, I would suggest, make sure you have the XC batteries. Because again, those are a little bit higher discharge rating. Other than that, it was a pretty good experience. Oh, earthquake there, bumping my camera. It was overall pretty good. With this big battery, the soldering iron is kind of heavy and a little bit off balance, but with the angled head, you can see I have it in the 45 degree, and that's where I used it. I started with it in the straight, and trying to hold it like this with that battery up in the air was not very comfortable. I did try it for a little bit in there and didn't really, but in that 45, it really made it comfortable to solder with. It felt like I had good control and it was better balanced in my hand. The one other gotcha, I guess, was that I'm used to having my soldering iron in, you can turn my camera over here, here's my soldering station. My soldering iron usually when it's not in my hand is in the holder. With this guy, when it's not in my hand, I would set it off to the side like this, and the hot tip is pointed up, and I believe on 2 different occasions I reached across to grab something, and that soldering iron got me in the arm up here. So that's something that's, you know, something to pay attention to, that your hot end is going to be pointed up in the air while you're working, and so that can create some difficulties if you're not careful. The LED light is nice, but I wish it had an LED on both sides, because quite frequently I would be working on something on this side because you're holding it this way and my work piece would be under here, but the LED light is up shining on this side. And so it would be nice if it had LEDs on both sides, or some cordless tools will actually have 3 LEDs. If it had something like that, that would be nice. I don't know, maybe that's getting nitpicky, but overall, so overall rating, how did I like the tool? I have to say I liked it. I don't think I'm going to be returning it. That was one question I was having when I was first messing with it and having trouble with getting a battery that would last more than a couple of minutes, and with dealing with the awkward feel of it until I got it all adjusted. I was really not certain if I would keep the tool. I was starting to have some doubts about that. Once I got the ergonomics situated and I got used to how I had to hold it, the weight of it really kind of stopped being an issue, and I was able to do the soldering job. And again, these were the soldering job that I needed. This was some high heat type items. The last time that I did these terminals, I did it with this soldering iron over here, and it took a little while. It probably took a minute and a half to heat up these terminals enough to desolder. And again, with this guy, it was like 30 seconds, maybe 15 to 30 seconds of heat on them, and then I could see the heat melt, start to creep around, and then a couple of seconds later they were free and ready to come off. So 90 watts of power is nice when you're soldering heavy gauge wiring. Now, is this a good soldering tool for RC? Because coming back to my channel's mostly about RC stuff, right? 90 watts is a lot of power. If you're running 8 scale, 5th scale, where you're doing a lot of 10 gauge, 8 gauge wires, a lot of the big bullets, maybe like the Castle 6mm bullets, or these 6.5mm bullets, or the EC5, the 5mm bullets. When you're doing big stuff like that, this large power is nice to have, and I would definitely give this guy a thumbs up for that. If you're doing 10 scale, you'll be dealing with more 12 gauge, maybe even 14 gauge wiring in some cases, and smaller EC3 plugs, XT60 plugs. For those cases, the 90 watts is a bit of an overkill. It'll still be nice to have, but it is a little bit of an overkill. With 10 scale, you could probably get by with a 40 watt iron even. You know, I have the 60 watt here, and that's really nice for the heavier wiring. I used a 40 watt iron for years on my 10 scale stuff. So it's a lot of power, but it's nice because you can get through your soldering jobs quickly. You know, tinning the new wire and such goes a lot quicker. Things like posts on, speed controllers go a lot quicker with the power. So overall, it is nice. Would I want to have this as my only soldering iron? I suspect that when I'm here at my workbench, most of my work is probably still going to get done with this, simply because it's lighter, it's easier. You know, when I set it there, it's safe. I can leave the power head powered on for a while. So I'll definitely keep this. It's definitely going to be going in my toolkit when I'm out bashing or whatever. And when I'm doing heavier gauge soldering jobs here on my desk, I'll definitely be pulling it out for like when I have to do these large cups and large wires. So that's it. That's my review of this Milwaukee cordless soldering iron, M12 cordless soldering iron, and I think it's I think I'm gonna be glad that I have this in my toolbox. Okay, so but if y'all are interested in a soldering tutorial, post that up in the comments. I can make that happen. I do have a couple of videos about soldering where I talk about the tools that I use. They're fairly old videos though. A lot of the tools that I talk about in those videos have been replaced for other things. So I'll link my old soldering videos in the description. If y'all want me to update them, if y'all want me to do a tutorial, a proper soldering tutorial, let me know in the comments section, and maybe we can make that happen. Okay, so until next time, y'all keep having fun, and I will talk to y'all later. Bye.